Thank you. Can I welcome you to St John's? It's a fascinating church. My particular involvement with it is I came to Chichester in 1980 as organist of the Cathedral, which is for anyone growing up in a parish church to aspire to this. If you told me when I was a choir boy in North East London that I'd finish up as organist of a cathedral, I would, wow, but would never have dreamed it possible. But anyway, I came in 1980 and I retired in 2008, but I'm still here and going strong. In 1982, I was asked to take on a role jointly with Nicholas Plumley, if any of you came across Nicholas, as diocesan organ advisor. Nicholas, sadly, for health reasons, has had to give up. So here I am, over 40 years later, as organ advisor for the Diocese of Chichester. It doesn't actually include this organ. Well, it does territorially, but this is a closed church, so the diocese is not involved. It's the church's conservation trust that looks after the church now. But my role as diocesan organ advisor, it's an enormous diocese, Chichester. Here we're at one end. If you just go westwards as far as Emsworth, you're into the Portsmouth diocese. But if you go from here to Brighton, you're less than halfway across the diocese. The last church in the diocese of Chichester going eastwards is at Camber Sands. And going north of the Downs, we include Gatwick Airport, we include the town of East Grinstead, and if you're driving south from Tunbridge Wells, just outside there's a tiny village called Frant, and that's the first one in the Chichester diocese there. So it's an enormous area, but it's been wonderful actually travelling around and seeing all these organs. For those of you who are visitors to Chichester and don't know, just a little bit of background. Chichester, of course, is a Roman city, the city of Noviomagus, with the circular walls. You can still walk around quite a fair percentage of the walls around here. The lovely market cross in the centre, which was built in 1501, and that's the centre of the hub. You've got North Street, South Street, East Street, and West Street. So you've got four quadrants. The southwest quadrant has always been and still is essentially church. It's the cathedral, the bishop's palace, and some of the diocesan offices, and mainly that is that quadrant. In the northeast quadrant, which was up there, the Grey Friars existed, and the still very fine and quite large-looking building, which is the choir of their church that they had there. The choir thing exists in Priory Park, up there. And in the southeast quadrant, where we are now, this whole area of land was the Blackfriars. So an awful lot of history here. And beyond that, of course, the Normans invaded, very sensibly, they invaded the Diocese of Chichester in 1066, Hastings being the other end of our diocese. But they did that in 1066. In 1075, they started to build Chichester Cathedral. So it was actually the second one that they refounded. The cathedral previously was down at Pagham Harbour, where St Wilfrid landed in the 9th century to convert the heathen of Sussex to Christianity. That was the first cathedral, but the Normans decided that it wasn't a good place for a cathedral, and so there were 9 cathedrals refounded by the Normans. The first one actually was the Old Sarum, which was in 1074, and of course that didn't last. It was built high outside Salisbury, got struck twice by lightning, and they gave up then and built the present Salisbury Cathedral subsequently. But there's an awful lot of history tucked in this really quite small city still. And there was enormous growth of population in the 17th and 18th century. And in the 17th, the area called the Pallants, which is just across there, was built. And some lovely architecture there, if you haven't walked through. When you come out of the church here, just opposite is a road coming in, and that's the end of East Pallant. And if you go along, there's East Pallant, West Pallant, North Pallant, and South Pallant. So in terms of one quadrant of the circle, you've got another north, south, east, and west, which also had a little market cross. It's not there anymore. But that was the sort of medieval times. With the development of the population, that Palance was one of the first areas to be built. But then it carried on in the 1700s, 1800s, and in the early 1800s, it was felt that there was still need for housing to be developed. And so they built this area, they developed this area with the very fine houses, which you can see in the street outside. And this was called the New Town. So this is the New Town area. Along with that, there was a need for more churches. There were just 6 very small medieval churches inside the Roman walls, inside the city. And the seating capacity of those combined was not very large. And so you suddenly found this feeling that they needed to develop it. One of the medieval churches, if you go down the Palance, go down East Pallant, get to the junction there and walk down West Pallant, and on the right is still All Saints Church. It's no longer a church, but the building is there, All Saints Church. And it was there that Thomas Wilkes, who was organist of the cathedral here from 1602 to 1623, it was in that church that he married his wife. So again, more history. Well, when it came to this area, quite big houses being built, wealthy people buying them, they felt they wanted their own church, and the Church of England was not going to provide it. So they took out the legal process of opening a proprietary chapel. In other words, they had to finance it themselves, they had to finance the building of it, and they had to finance the running of it. So the money was all raised by public and private subscription. And prime among those initiating the project was John Marsh, who Alan Green, he's a local historian who actually, his parents worshipped here when it was still going as a church, so he was a choir boy here. Alan Green's written a marvellous book about Newtown and this church. And he describes John Marsh as barrister, composer, organist, player of the viola and cello, philanthropist, mathematician, astronomer, writer, and prolific diarist. So I just say he was a bit of a dilettante, actually. I think, and I must say, I'm very pleased that he wasn't about when I was organist at the cathedral, because in his diaries, he doesn't mince his words, and he was not very impressed with the music at the cathedral at that time, was recording everything that was wrong. He obviously, he'd go and listen to a service, and there was a pipe out of tune on the cathedral organ, so he'd take it on himself to go up inside and tune it afterwards, and so on. So I think he must have been, quite a difficult person to have to deal with. But he lived in 2 houses, 7 and 8, in North Pallant. There's a blue plaque on 7. 8 doesn't exist anymore. But that was where he lived, and that was where he spent most of his adult life. And his diaries, which still exist, many, many volumes of them, from 1765 to his death in 1828. So there's an awful lot of history recorded there. And interestingly enough, he had these 2 houses. Quite how he worked the 2, we don't know. But he had an organ, his own organ, in number 7 East Pallant. But he designed it in such a way that you could play it either from number 7 East Pallant or a console at the other end from number 8 East Pallant. It was actually thought that organ had just disappeared historically, but actually it's only sort of 10 or 15 years ago it came to light. It's now in the church in Bleasby, a little village called Bleasby in Nottinghamshire. And Bias, the British Institute of Organ Studies, had a study day there a couple of years ago to go and see and hear the John Marsh organ. Well, it was Marsh, he was a shareholder in the building of this church, and he became the warden of the church when it first opened, so he was very closely involved. And it was at his insistence that an organ was included in the plans. And the architect James Elms, who designed the church, also designed the case of the organ and specified its position on the gallery as part of his original drawings. You can see the original design from Elms, and you can see how the organ actually fitted in. If you look at the wall above you, you can see the line of an alcove. And the organ actually fitted into that alcove and was recessed a little bit. The only reason it's higher now is that at the end of this story, when its time came to put it back, the architects were worried about the stability of the gallery. So there's now a steel floor inserted underneath the organ, but that means it's that little bit higher, so it couldn't actually go back where it was from that. But anyway, you've got that illustration of the organ, and beneath it you can see an early photograph which shows the actual case as it was realised. The organ was built by John Pike, England, who previously restored our cathedral organ in 1806. So in 1813, the organ was here. The records are not clear because it seems maybe they had problems with cash flow in the building, which we know they did have. So it's probable that the great organ was fitted in time for the opening of the building, and the swell organ came a little bit later when they'd raised a bit more money. But certainly by 1825, there's a London organ builder called Alexander Buckingham who travelled around the country and left copious notes, very detailed notes about organs that he saw. And he came here in 1825, and the details of the organ, as they were then, are recorded in his diaries. Very specifically, dimensions of the case, the type of woodwork that was used, the scaling of the pipes, that means their width in relation to their height, and so on, all sorts of details. And Pike was one of our last great classical organ builders before organ design changed in the mid-1800s. It was the Great Exhibition of 1851 where Henry Willis produced a new sort of organ which included kind of pneumatic assistance to make it lighter to play. As they got bigger and wind pressures were increased, they were becoming heavier and heavier. And Cavalier-Coll in France and a chap called Joseph Barker invented a Barker lever. If talking about it, what I say is most of us probably old enough to have driven a car in the days before power-assisted steering and servo-assisted brakes. And that was the difference of the Great Exhibition organ. You could suddenly have bigger organs, lots more keyboards, a lot more stops, and it wasn't getting heavier to play. So we see this organ as being very, very much at the end of the classical period. And in common with the English tradition at the time, the organ had no pedals, and it had a short compass swell, which means that the swell keyboard comes down and it stops on the G below middle C. And the great keyboard is what's called a long compass. So organs normally go 2 octaves below middle C. If you see this organ, there's one key below, which looks as though it ought to be a B, but in fact when you play it, it's a low G. So you've got a couple of pipes. So if you're playing in G major, you can make it sound a little bit more bass heavy there. And if you play the C sharp at the bottom, well, in this period, before equal temperament, who was writing music in D flat major or C sharp, you know? So that note doesn't get used a lot. So when you press C sharp, it plays the low A. And that was what was known as long compass. You could have more notes than that as well. But the idea of having no pedals, it's quite interesting. It was really Mendelssohn, I think, who, when he came over here and he was asked to play the organ at St Paul's Cathedral, and went and said, I can't play this, it's got no pedals. And suddenly the English were shamed into introducing what they called German pedals. But then when you think back, Handel knew all about fully fledged pedal laws. When he came to this country, they were developed in the time of Buxtehude in Bach. You've got the pedal solos in Bach. But the English somehow never got round to it. I have my own theory about that. It's a bit of a facetious theory, I have to say. And that's because if you read the chapter minutes, not here, but many cathedrals, and Thomas Wilkes was always being upbraided by the chapter for coming into the evening service straight out of the tavern and being the worse for wear. And I can imagine an organist in this country going to the chapter and saying, look, isn't this great? On the continent, they've got these pedals. Can I have pedals? And the dean would say, if you can't stand straight on your 2 feet, we're not going to pay money to give you pedals. So anyway, that's my theory. But anyway, that was, at this time, the common thing. So it had no pedals and this long compass. Well, it stayed like that until the end of the century. In 1898, the organ was rebuilt by the firm of Heel of Plymouth. And if you look at the other side of the sheet with the photograph, you can see there what they did. Following the fashion of the time, Heel increased the number of stops and added the extra pipes to the swell to complete the full compass. He also added a pedal organ, expanding the width of the old case, which you can see in that photograph, to hide some of the new pipes. But the tallest pipes were either side against the wall, painted white, so they hoped you wouldn't notice them, I think. But that's the way it was done in the 1890s. Well, music here continued to be very important after the time of the death of John Marsh. Two of our cathedral organists, Thomas Bennett, who was organist from 1803 until 1848, and then his son, Henry Roberts Bennett, who was organist of the cathedral from 1848 to 1860, also had the post of organist for this church. Might seem a bit odd, but in fact the tradition at the church here was to have a Sunday evening service. And in cathedrals, evensong on Sundays is mid-afternoon. So today you have 3 services still at the cathedral every Sunday: matins, sung, mass, and then in the afternoon, evensong. But they would come on here and play for the organ. So in that sense, you can see there was a good standard of music being maintained. And then in the following century, and this is quite interesting, the incumbent of this church from 1902 to 1948 was the Reverend Charles Edward Steinitz, whose son Paul Steinitz grew up here and went on to be conductor of the London Bach Society and the Steinitz Art Fairs. The vicarage is a lovely house. If you come out there and turn left and walk down, it's the last house on the left. The road bears around to the left after that. But it's the last house there, lovely vicarage. So you can see how the sort of music remained very important. After World War II, however, congregations dwindled, and St John's, along with many other churches, fell on hard times, with the result that eventually, in 1973, the chapel was finally closed as a public place of worship. Being Grade 1 listed, it was vested in what was then called the Redundant Churches Fund, now the Churches Conservation Trust. And that exists because the Church of England, particularly, is in a very difficult situation. Where you've got a listed building which is closed, you can't just put it down. There's a difficulty, but the Church of England can't make use of it because it's no longer viable. So the idea is that you have a trust into which English Heritage will put some money every year, and the Church Commissioners will put some money every year, but they also have to raise additional money. And those trusts, the redundant churches and now the Churches Conservation Trust, look after all these churches in the country, and there's a lot of them. There are 3 around here. There's another one in the little village of Mundham, and if you go down to Selsey, right at the end, just before the road goes into Selsey, there's a turning and it says Church Norton, and if you go down there to the very end, there's a car park, and there's a big burial area, and there's a little chapel. And the chapel is in fact the chancel of St Wilfrid's Church. When he came down from Ripon, he went into Pagham Harbour, he landed there, he built his church there, which functioned as a cathedral until the Normans invaded and decided to move it here. So they're wonderful work that they do. However, in 1980, dry rot was discovered in the alcove at the back there behind the organ, into which it was then recessed. So the organ was dismantled, and the alcove was demolished, and the wall filled in, as you see it now. I don't think they quite thought anything about what would happen to the organ. But if this had been France, Germany, or other European countries, the organ would have been classed as a national treasure, and funds would have been available to have it restored. Sadly, that is not the case in our own country, so for close on half a century until now, the organ remained in pieces on the gallery, just stacked on the floor in the gallery. At the beginning of this century, the early 2000s, the Friends of St John's started an appeal to raise money to bring the organ back to life again. And our local very good Baroque orchestra supported this initiative. And they had made a replica photo. It's still actually on the side there now, but they had a replica blown up of the drawing of the original case. The artist, my colleague Nicholas Plumley, great artist as well, coloured it in, and it was put up in position there. So for 20 years or so in this century, people came in to the church and they could see what had been, but it didn't actually tell them anything about why it wasn't there, or whether it was ever going to be there again. Unfortunately, they didn't manage to raise enough money. It was quite a really daunting sum that had to be raised. So with the approval of the donors, the money was allowed to be used by the Church's Conservation Trust for other work on the building. So that money was then lost. Then, by a stroke of enormous good fortune, a local charitable trust founded in 1973 by a lady who lived in the Pallants was looking for a major project to mark its 50th anniversary. And they decided to do what the Charity Commission encouraged some of these charities to do. Normally, if you're an endowment fund, you have a portfolio of investments, you have an annual income from it, and you apply that income to charitable purposes. And the majority of the work done by this charity is actually to help parents send their children to a cathedral as choristers. Because the bursary, you're talking, if they're at the cathedral, they're boarders, they have to live at school. The fees are, in today's terms, over £20,000 a year. Until COVID, the cathedral paid half of that, but the parents had to pay the other half. And after COVID, the chapter have actually had to reduce what they paid below 50%. And I personally have an axe to grind in this, because when I was young, growing up in northeast suburbs of London, there was a public school near us, Bancroft School in Woodford, and it had a chapel and an organ. And I'd fallen in love with organs when my mother took me to church and said, I couldn't wait to join the choir and do that. And I said to my parents, that's why I want to go to school. But my parents would never have been able to afford to send me to a fee-paying school. But luckily, there was at that time a thing called the direct grant system, because I was born just after World War II, and of course what happened when all the troops, including my father who was in the army in Italy, when they came back, demobbed from the army in 1946, the following year the birth rate went... I have to be a little bit vulgar and say my mother, who had a very ripe sense of humour, said he didn't even wait to take his rucksack off his back. So I was in 1947. Bless her. So anyway, I decided I wanted to go, and if you put your name down for a direct grant scholarship, you had to pass the 11 plus well enough, and also had to pass the entrance test to the public school. You too, yeah. And I was so lucky. The primary school told my parents, no, he shouldn't take the exam, he'll never pass it because it's a bigger curriculum, wider curriculum than the state primary schools were teaching. But my parents very wisely said, well, if he sits it and doesn't get in, well, he'll be disappointed. But if he does get in, well, good luck. So I took it, and I found out years later, because there was a lot on the exam that I couldn't answer. But one of the masters, when I got into sixth form, came and saw me and said, I'm glad to see you made it to sixth form. He said, I marked your common entrance paper, he said. And I was really struck, because a lot of the people taking it obviously couldn't do some of the questions, so they just left it blank. But he said, you put a number for the question, and in every case you wrote, we have not been taught this at my school yet. So, without that, I wouldn't be here today. So anyway, the charity, the Pallant Charitable Trust, volunteered to fund this, in addition to the work they're doing paying fees at the school, but out of capital growth. This is something the Charity Commission quite encouraged. If you take the value of the fund as it was 50 years ago and the value today, it has grown enormously, and so has the income too. But to cream off some of that capital, to pay for a project, is what the trustees wanted to do. And so they said that they would take this on. And under the guidance of our organ advisor, Dr. Nicholas Thistlethwaite, Gertzer and Gwynn from Worksop have spent the last 2 years restoring the organ to its original form as it was in 1825 when it was Buckingham came and recorded all the details. Dominic Gwynn from the firm was mentioned earlier. Dominic was involved in this. He was coming up to retirement and he really wanted this to be his last project. But sadly, the negotiations took much longer. The Church's Conservation Trust were not terribly keen to take it on because they said, well, how's it going to be maintained? But I'm pleased to say that Callan Trust is also handing over a fairly large capital sum to the Church's Conservation Trust to go in special interest-bearing investment so that the income can be applied to this. But of necessity, the case that you now see is entirely new, except for the display pipes, which are original but have been regilded. The actual form of the organ, of course, is in the drawing and in the photograph, so and it's in Buckingham's notebook. So it is a replica, but the case is entirely new. But inside, the original actional pipes have been reused wherever possible. The opening recital, originally planned for June, had to be delayed because the master organ builder in the firm sadly got pneumonia, and so work stopped for quite a number of weeks. So we're not yet officially open, and the opening recital is going to be on 25th of October, when an international recitalist, Margaret Phillips, who specialises in early English organs and organ music, will be coming to give the recital. We had mention of pitch earlier, and so, in being amber players, you may be interested in the question of pitch here. Because in 1813, when the organ was built, one can understand that pitch had risen beyond Baroque pitch, but was not yet at A440. So we didn't actually know, of course, until all the pipes and things were unpacked and taken up to the factory, what the pitch was, but it's between the two. And there was quite a lengthy discussion about what to do about that, because the Concert of 12 for Baroque orchestra are very keen that it should be used for Handel organ concertos and so on. And the logic was that if you were to raise it to modern pitch, you would have to cut down the length of all the pipes. So you would actually be interfering with historic material. If you put little extensions on the top of the pipe that could be removed, then you could lower the pitch, but a future generation could take those extensions off at any time, and its middle pitch would once again be in use. So that's what's happened. Every pipe has got an extension. You won't see it on the front pipes if you're looking for it, because front pipes, you alter a pipe by its length, but you can't have a slider on top of that. So what they did, you don't want to see it in a display of pipes, they cut a slot down the back of a tall pipe, and like a sardine can, they roll the slot down, and the length of the pipe is the point at which the air can first escape. So all of those display pipes will be shorter in length than you actually see, because at the back they've got some rolled out. But they are the original pipes. So that was a decision, and it has been used. The Concert of 12 did a concert here in September, and that was going to follow on from the opening recital, but they had permission to use it, although actually the two reed stops, the trumpet and oboe, were not back in by then, but then in a Handel organ concerto you don't use the trumpet and the oboe. So Timothy Rivald, the assistant organist at the Cathedral, was here to play, and it was very, very successful. The Gabriele Consort director, Catherine Martin, came down. They always had Concert of 12 have a guest director, and Catherine Martin came down and directed the Concert of 12 in these two Handel organ concertos. So there, just about on time too, you have a potted history of the organ. For many of us, it's been just very, very exciting. We really thought that organ would just one day, all those pipes would just be put in a skip and taken away. But thanks to this lovely lady who lived in South Halland and the trust that she founded, her husband was quite wealthy, and when he died, I imagine it was probably to save a bit on inheritance tax. The advisor said, well, if you put a big sum, you can set up a trust. So she did that, and then when she died, she put all of her own estate into it as well. So there it is, and we're enormously grateful. I'm very happy to take any questions. You'll leave lunch. Thank you for asking me to talk. It's a project that's just been very dear to my heart, and I'm so grateful to the Halland Trust for taking it on. And without that, you'd be sitting here looking at the backboard. Question?
What is a Halland?
It's because, for some quirk of history, I mentioned that you've got a cross within a cross, north, south, east and west. And the area within this south-east quadrant has the Hallands. And that area of land was owned and under the direction of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Palatine. So that's why they're called the Hallands. And so the church, which Thomas Wilkes was married in, that was actually a peculiar under the direction of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.